A very busy news week. We've heard explosive testimony from former Bosasa COO Angelo Agrizzi at the state capture inquiry. Now, the Makgoro Enquiry into advocates Nomgcobo, Jiba and Mrwebi's fitness to hold office also commenced this week. For a wrap on those stories, we're joined by Tiso Blackstar legal journalist Karyn Maughan. Karyn, another interesting week. Of course, again, more explosive testimony from Bosasa's former COO.
Well, of course, we had some degree last week when the Sunday Times and News 24 both wrote those stories about the potential evidence that was going to come out in relation to the former president and, of course, to Nomgcobo, Jiba and Mrwebi themselves. And it's fascinating that we're having two parallel inquiries who are running next to each other, which both address substantive issues of prosecutorial fitness to hold office. These incredibly explosive claims from Angelo Agrizzi that in fact money was paid over through former Correctional Services Commissioner Linda Mrwebi to Nomgcobo, Jiba and Mrwebi, and of course her PA at the time, Jackie Lepinka, and these claims that essentially this investigation into Bosasa that had originated from an explosive SIU report in 2009 simply wasn't pushed through because these senior people within the NPA had been bribed not to do so. Of course, major denials from them, but it's going to have a bearing on both of these inquiries, which way those revelations go.
It certainly doesn't fare well from what we've heard in the past about, so many aspersions being cast on the credibility of the National Prosecuting Authority. Yes, there's a new boss in charge now who clearly has a lot of work to do, but does it somewhat give some credence to what has been alleged in recent times about the state of the National Prosecuting Authority?
I think the difficulty is that there doesn't seem at this point to be substantive evidence that hard-hitting corruption prosecutions were in fact pursued. And one of the major allegations that both Jiba and Mrwebi will have to deal with, of course, was this withdrawal of charges against former crime intelligence boss Richard Mdluli, who had proclaimed himself to be a Zuma loyalist, had actually taken to the extent of actually writing to former President Jacob Zuma when he was in power and saying, if I will support you. This was at the time when he was, these charges were potentially hanging over his head. I will support you. I will assist you in your race for leadership, etc., etc. So, with those charges being withdrawn and then courts of law, including the Supreme Court of Appeal, turning around and saying, this is a thoroughly irrational decision. This decision must be, potentially reversed and subsequently, of course, not appealed by Mokgoro. There is a background which would make these kind of allegations take root. We don't have a National Prosecuting Authority for many years who has taken a tough stance on corruption, who has actually chosen to pursue corruption cases, be it Mdluli, be the case against former President Zuma, without a court of law compelling them to do so. And these kind of revelations just add fuel to that fire.
I think a conversation we're having in the newsroom, this almost, as you watch it all unfold, whether you're at the commission or you're watching it on television, it almost sounds like a movie. Code names such as Snail, and is it Snake?
Snake, yes.
Yeah, so, talk to us a bit about that. Does that speak to how these so-called underhand activities were allegedly taking place, and there were many who knew about it?
Well, what's fascinating for me, for example, is we have Jiba prior, when this whole thing starts coming out, saying, I want to know who is accepting bribes in my name. Now, Jackie Lepinka was Linda Mrwebi, I think she was his PA. There have been allegations that they may have been involved in a relationship of some kind. That evidence, of course, still needs to come to the fore. But she definitely had a relationship with him, and we know that a lot of the evidence, the documentation, in certain instances were emails coming from her. Now, his allegation, Agrizzi's allegation, is that Linda Mrwebi said, all of them are corrupt in doing his bidding. But I think we're going to see a strong line of defense coming from Jiba and Mrwebi to say, If essentially you guys were the victims of a scam by Linda MT, that there was no such in fact no such payments occurring. What is difficult for them, however, is why then was the case not pursued? What were the barriers? Was it simple ineptitude that the people responsible for this took advantage of? We're also going to have to hear from Linda MT, because if he comes forward and says, I know nothing about this, I would never have done, which it's very likely to do, given that he's facing a criminal case, the commission and indeed prosecutors who take this matter forward are going to have to come with hard, substantive evidence. We need lifestyle audits. We need to show, as we did, for instance, with the Jackie Salibi case, clear discrepancies in levels of income that are declared and way lifestyles are lived.
Still on the issue of bribes, journalists also dragged into the whole issue, and I think many South Africans are asking themselves, what has become, I guess, of the profession. I guess these are just allegations at this stage. But of course, if we look at SANEF's response also to allegations of payments made to, for example, to support the SABC 8, let's talk a bit about that.
Well, essentially, there was, some of the evidence has suggested that a payment of 100,000 rand was made by Agrizzi for so-called strategic purposes to the SABC 8. Now, as I understand it, SANEF have actually said that essentially that was a crowdfunding exercise, and that they were not aware of any, or actually, I think strongly have actually denied it, as far as I understand. And we haven't heard that evidence actually necessarily being ventilated in a substantive way in the commission. That may still be happening. We know that there have been references to journalists been paid. No names have been named, and the inquiry evidence leader chose not, for reasons best known to them, to push for names at this stage. But I think as journalists we would hope that if those revelations are made, and the truth must out.
Would it be in the best interest of the profession for those names to be mentioned?
Yes, if there is substantive evidence that there were indeed payments made, it must come out. Because we can't expect to hold others in judgment and then ourselves, when these kind of revelations are made, claim some kind of defense that you can't put this stuff in the open. If people were paid to not do their jobs, whether the NPA, the police or journalists, that evidence must out for the benefit of all of us. And then, in the wake of that, I would hope, if it's substantiated, if there's evidence of money, if there's proof that this in fact occurred, that we as a profession would have a long, hard look at ourselves and how we've conducted ourselves. But I think that the commission is going to have to deal with that, because if they don't come out and ventilate those names, if they've backed them up with evidence, it's going to essentially being accused of potentially being a whitewash or attempt to protect journalists from the very same interrogation that they impose on other people, and that's simply not fair.
I want to talk about that issue of crowdfunding. I read that statement by SANEF, and doesn't that seem to be the problem, though, that you don't know who is donating money to you? So very much like would be in an election. I'll make that comparison, where you get people donating to you, and clearly, as per that letter that Agrizzi spoke about, is strategic reasons. So crowdfunding, yes, as said by SANEF, but isn't that the problem, when you don't know who's donating for a particular cause and you only find out perhaps at a later stage that this is the case?
Well, I think there's two very different things going on here. There's a suggestion by Angelo Agrizzi that essentially journalists were paid not to cover Bosasa, or not to, for in Bosasa's interest. So there was an exchange of money for a very specific outcome that went against the tenets of our profession, because we're going out there to expose corruption, to expose malfeasance, no fear, no favor. That is the standard by which we are held to. And then there's this other thing, that the SABC 8 received money through this crowdfunding from Bosasa for strategic reasons. Now, even at the worst scenarios, if that money did indeed, which of course there have been denials about, if that money was indeed paid, those journalists wouldn't have known. It was not. There was not a desired outcome. There wasn't an outcome of, I'm going to give Karyn this money and she's not going to report on this story. The thing was, we're going to donate this money to people who are fighting a very well publicized battle for media freedom within this institution, and who are facing, labor action, who are trying to fight their cause in the courts very successfully, as they eventually did. And we're going to give money for strategic reasons to that. So I think to equate equate those things, corruption or a deliberate attempt to subvert what you're supposed to do as a journalist for money, versus people receiving unknowingly funding for a very legitimate legal cause that they were fighting. I don't think in any respect you can equate those two things.
Let's talk about Shamila Batohi. She begins on the 1st of February. Yes, that's just a matter of days away. And she has a mammoth task in light of both these commissions that are sitting at the moment. She has a mammoth task to change the perception of the National Prosecuting Authority that most South Africans have and restore that credibility. Talk to us about some of the first things she would need to do come the 1st of February.
Well, if we watch her interview, and I think it's very insightful when you go back and actually look at what she said, I think there's a real sense that she wants people to work together. She's framed that very much, so she has the SIU, she has the AFU, there is the NPA. I mean, they're separate bodies, but how can they really start working together where, for instance, the forensic prowess of the SIU is utilized with the prosecutorial expertise of the NPA? How do we bring together teams? We know with the state capture cases, which unfortunately with the case against Duduzane Zuma being withdrawn this week, there are no more of them at this stage, that there were in fact and are in fact a group of people working, including, as I understand it, individuals from the Financial Intelligence Center and from Treasury. So how do we bring groups of people together, even potentially, as I understand it, people like the Helen Suzman Foundation, who say they've been approached by the NPA, and get people to start addressing the clear resource deficits in the NPA, because they really don't have the money to spend huge amounts of money on investigations, and work together as teams so that people who have specific areas of expertise can pursue cases in a way that is effective and will result in successful prosecutions. And I think that when we see that kind of thing happening, and when the NPA starts taking the nation into its confidence about big high-profile cases, we know, for instance, there are prosecutions against individuals in the land bank. We know that the case against Richard Mdluli himself, the kidnapping issue, there will be judgment in May. The NPA also needs to start saying these are the cases these are the cases that you may not know about, and not feel like its narrative or its trajectory needs to be defined by what the media finds interesting. But most crucially, there's going to have to be some kind of movement on this Bosasa matter in the wake of this evidence. I don't think Mzansi is going to be very, very happy if there isn't some kind of decision. We saw the NPA saying that the docket was handed over on the 14th of January. And if they choose not to pursue this case, I think there's going to be a huge level of outrage.
You don't want to see another whitewash. Karyn Maughan, thank you very much for chatting to us. I would still have loved to have spoken to you about the non-renewal of Robert McBride's contract with IPID, but perhaps we can do that some other time. Karyn Maughan, who's a legal journalist, of course, speaking to us about the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, the testimony that we've seen over this past week, as well as the Makgoro Enquiry. Thank you very much for your time.